hope you like this. If you do, give it a thumbs up and leave any comments below. And remember to subscribe to the channel to be kept up to date on all my hypnotic bedtime stories. So I hope you enjoy the story. So as you listen to me, I don't know whether you'll drift comfortably asleep deeper with the sound of my voice, with the words that I'm using, or perhaps with the spaces between my words. And as you comfortably drift asleep, I'm just going to tell you a story about a woman who has been finding things very stressful. She's been finding herself lost in her own mind, lost in thoughts and worries, really struggling to process different life events. And so she decides to take a break from it all for a while. She decides that she wants to try something new and calming. So she goes and visits a monastery and decides to stay in this monastery for a while. And every day in this monastery, she goes and sits in the garden. She closes her eyes and she starts to listen. She listens to the sound of her breathing, listens to the sounds of people milling around her, listens to the sounds of birds in the garden, listens to sounds outside of the garden, and she gradually broadens her hearing out, listening to things further and further away. And then she focuses on her feeling her breathing in and out, feeling the way her chest moves, the way her shoulders move, the way her arms move as she breathes, feeling the sensation of the air as it flows in and out of her nostrils, feeling the movement of her eyelids and her eyes, feeling the subtle, gentle movements and sways and the odd twitch throughout her body, feeling the sensations of the ground beneath her. And she gradually spreads out her physical awareness. And then she focuses on her visual awareness, seeing the way the light in front of her eyes shifts and changes as clouds pass over the sun or as people walk past. Seeing the way that she sees like little sparks, little flashes of light from time to time, little patches of colour and movement, like little circles of movement and subtle dark shades against the dark background, and seeing how it can almost look like some static. And then noticing that every now and then she gets a glimmer of an image. And while the images begin to appear and grow and increase, she notices how her inner dialogue changes from a chatter she's uncontrolled of to something she has control of, to something that just seems to be silent. And she watches the images and notices thoughts, that there are some images that come and go just like thoughts coming and going, that reduce and get less and less, fewer and fewer, as she sits there meditating. And she sits and meditates in this way every single day to really learn about herself, her inner awareness. And while she sits and meditates, so she starts to spontaneously find herself walking through the countryside, walking through some grassy hills, and then down towards a lake. And as she's walking down towards the lake, she notices there's a cabin down there on the edge of the lake. And she feels drawn to that cabin. She feels somehow like that cabin is her sanctuary. That cabin is a safe place for her to go. The thing that she wanted to gain from coming to this monastery was some kind of inner connection, something that can connect what goes on here in the monastery with what goes on in everyday life. Something where she could just think about it or close her eyes for a moment and be somewhere that brings what she needs at that moment in her life. And she has this feeling that this cabin is that place. And so she walks down the hillside, down towards that cabin, down towards all that woodland surrounding the lake, the most beautiful blue lake. And she can see as she's walking down the hill that off in the distance, beyond the woodland, are mountains, and off behind that is just pure blue sky. And she walks down to that cabin and thinks to herself that it's the most beautiful wooden log cabin that she's seen. So she walks down to that cabin, enters the cabin, releasing the latch as she walks in, hearing that latch go, opening the door and hearing it as it moves open and closing it behind her. And she can hear a crackling log fire in here. And she looks around the inside of the cabin, feels the warmth in the cabin, almost like the cabin is giving her a comfortable hug. And she goes and makes herself a nice drink and sits down by that fire and just feels a sense of deep peace, calm and relaxation. And while she sits down in front of that fire and feels that peace, calm and relaxation, her eyes begin to close and she begins to drift off into a reverie, drift off into a daydream or a sleep. And as she does, her mind begins to travel, and she finds herself waking up in a rowing boat in the middle of that lake outside the cabin. And she feels like there's something here to learn. And she wakes up in a rowing boat in the middle of that lake. And in that rowing boat, she can hear the very gentle lapping of the water against the boat. she can see the subtle movement of the waves across the lake. Notice the way that light dances and moves on the surface. Seeing some dragonfly flying just above the lake. And getting a perspective on the forest, on the woodland surrounding the lake. And she's unsure why she has awoken here, or what she's supposed to do. So she decides to just start rowing, and she picks a direction. She feels she's probably not supposed to just row back to the cabin and go back in the cabin and sit in front of the fire again. So she decides just to row in a different direction. And so she randomly picks a direction and starts to row towards the shore. And she rows, and she can hear the oars as they push through the water. Feel the occasional splash and spray of the water. Smell that fresh water smell. And she rows and rows across the lake. And after some time, she rows all the way to the distant shore. And then she does one big row to launch the boat up onto the shore a little bit, so that she can climb out of the boat onto the shore without getting wet feet. And she climbs out of the boat onto the shore and decides to cut through the woods and continue to explore. So she walks through the woods in the direction of the mountains. And she notices that it gets darker and darker the further into the woods she goes. And she can hear different sounds that are unfamiliar to her. She knows they're sounds of nature, but to her they're unfamiliar. And she feels a little anxious with this, with the unfamiliarity. And she's aware that she has to begin to gain some courage as she walks through the woods. So she walks through the woods, gaining courage, but unsure how she's doing it. She's not trying to gain courage. It's just happening as she walks. And the more she walks, the more courage she gains, while also gaining wisdom. And she's aware it's important to have the courage and the wisdom together. And she notices this woodland is heading slightly upwards. So she follows it and climbs and follows and keeps climbing. And it gets darker and darker the denser the woods get. And then eventually she finds a clearing that's quite high up, that looks down the other side into a deep valley, and the other side of the valley is the foot of the mountains, and then the mountains stretch up out of sight. And she notices that the sun has set, the moon has risen, and apart from the moonlight illuminating the area, everything is in darkness. And she feels this compulsion to give a whistle, and so she whistles into the valley. She doesn't know why she feels a compulsion to do it, but she just feels a compulsion to whistle into the valley. So she whistles into the valley, and then is silent to listen to the way that whistle reverberates and travels in all directions and bounces back to her ears, and what that whistle tells her about the shape and the makeup of the valley. She then starts climbing down into the valley, walking down the steep woodland into the valley. A part of her feels like she should just go back onto that boat and head back to the cabin, or even better, perhaps just wake up. But another part of her is aware that this is all part of her experience and learning and growth, and that if her mind is giving her this learning experience, she should be grateful to it. She should accept the learning experience and go with it and see what she can learn. And so she goes down into the valley. And deep down in the valley, she sees that there's a fast-flowing stream heading from one side, cutting right through the valley and down the other side. And she wonders, should she cross the stream and carry on towards the mountains, or perhaps just turn and walk either up or downstream. And she decides that the way to go is upstream, and to see where it would take her, see where this stream begins. And so she starts to follow the stream. And at one point she decides to put her hand in the water. She just feels this compulsion to touch the water, and she feels how cold that water is, and deduces that the stream must originate high in the mountains. And so she follows that stream. And she doesn't know how far she'll be following it. She just knows she needs to follow it until she's learned the necessary lessons. And she's sure that when she has, she'll wake up by that fire in the cabin. And so she follows that stream. And it's easier, she finds, to walk following the stream, where she's not having to push through dense woodland, than to walk through the dense woodland. And after what seemed like hours of walking, she finds herself at a waterfall. And she feels she doesn't want to have to climb up the side of the waterfall and carry on following this to the mountains. But then she thinks she doesn't know what to do if she doesn't do that. And while she's thinking, she suddenly hears some bats, and then sees a bat flying out from behind the waterfall. It seemed to pierce straight through the waterfall. And she could notice it in the moonlight, the way the moon glistened off the spray. And she realised there was a cave behind the waterfall. And so she walked close to the side of the rocks, shimmied along the rocks, trying to avoid getting soaking wet. And then noticed there was a cave behind the waterfall. And she lit herself a fire in that cave. And the remaining few bats flew out of the now lit cave. And she sat by that fire in the cave, hearing the rushing water of the waterfall, feeling the peace and calm of the situation, noticing how the fire she'd lit was making shadows and light dance on the cave walls and making the water glow in the night. And she gazed at that glowing, dancing water. And while she was gazing at that dancing, glowing water, so she noticed her focus narrowing and narrowing and narrowing, until she found herself drifting inside and finding herself in a pit somewhere. And she knew that she was perfectly fine and perfectly safe here, but saw that there was a note that was in her own handwriting that said, "Find your way out of this hole and you'll be ready to go home." And she went over to the sides and she jumped up and couldn't reach the top. She went to another side and jumped up and she couldn't reach the top again. She started walking around, looking around the hole, looking around this pit, trying to figure out what she can use to get out. And as she looked around, she found that there wasn't really much to use. All there was one shovel. And she tried to place the shovel against the edge of the pit and climb onto the handle, and she still couldn't reach her way out. And she tried to dig into the walls of the pit, but found that they were reinforced and that she couldn't get through them. And so she sat down on the floor in the middle of the pit. She looked around herself, looked at all sides, looked above her, put her hands down beside her, closed her eyes, took a deep breath, took an even longer breath out, and told herself to connect, to focus, to discover, to learn, to relax, to have courage, to believe in yourself. And then she saw a flash of light, almost like a firework or a shooting star had just happened in front of her, that lit up the night. And she realized it was a flash of insight, that somehow she had figured it out. When she went and got the shovel, and in the middle of the pit, she started digging. And every shovelful that she dug, she carried over to one side, and she emptied the shovelful next to that side, and then she'd dig some more and take that over and put it next to the side. And she dug down about half her height, about to her waist deep, and then dug a small circle in the ground, and then dug wider and wider and wider, And as she was doing this, the mud she was taking from the middle, she was placing at one side. And after many hours of hard work, many hours of digging and focus, she'd created a mud slope that went from about halfway to the middle at about a 45-degree angle, all the way to the exit, to the top of that pit. And then she just walked up that slope and climbed up the narrow ledge, the narrow gap just between the top of what she'd dug and placed, and climbed out. And no sooner had she done that, and she stretched and opened her eyes by that fire in the cabin, and looked around her and saw that it was morning. And so she left the cabin and started walking along the edge of the lake, and she could see the rowing boat in the middle of the lake. And she walked along the edge of the lake and then turned up and walked up that hill and carried on up that hill. And as she walked up that hill, so she woke up in the monastery and realized she was ready to leave, to go home and to fall asleep in her own bed, and to integrate all this into her life, leading to her being able to be calmer, leading her to many changes that she'd come here seeking.